I flew to San Diego expecting to spend a quiet weekend with my grandmother. Instead, I found her lying alone in a dark apartment that smelled of spoiled milk, old medicine, and forgotten birthdays. She was so weak she couldn't even lift her head when I called her name. Less than 30 minutes later, I opened my phone and saw my own father smiling beneath the warm lights of an expensive Italian restaurant, his arm wrapped around a woman barely older than I had been when I enlisted. That was the exact moment something inside me changed forever. 48 hours later, police officers would place handcuffs around his wrists, and for the first time in years, justice would finally walk through our family's front door. My name is Abigail Turner. I'm a major in the United States Army, and for most of my adult life I believed discipline could solve almost anything. Discipline gets you through 18-hour shifts. It gets you through deployments where every unfamiliar sound makes your pulse jump. It gets you through funerals of soldiers you promised to bring home. But there is one battlefield no military training prepares you for: family, especially when the enemy turns out to be your own father. The phone rang at exactly 2:07 in the morning. I had just fallen asleep after a week-long training exercise outside Fort Carson. My body ached in places I hadn't noticed until I finally crawled into bed. The ringtone cut through the silence with an urgency that made every instinct inside me wake before the rest of my body did. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. Hello. For several seconds I heard nothing except uneven breathing. Then a woman's voice spoke softly. Is this Abigail Turner? Yes. My name is Helen. I live across the hall from your grandmother. My heart tightened. Before she said another word, I already knew something was terribly wrong. I don't know how else to reach you, she continued. Your grandmother keeps saying your name. She hasn't been outside in days. I finally let myself into her apartment because I was afraid. I sat upright. What happened? I think you need to come. That was all she said. Not because she didn't want to explain. Because there are moments when words become too small for the truth. By 3:15 a.m., I had packed a duffel bag. By 4:40, I was sitting on the first flight to San Diego. I didn't call my father. I didn't call my younger brother. For years, Dad had insisted everything was under control. He lived only 25 minutes away from Grandma. Whenever I asked how she was doing, his answer never changed. She's stubborn, Abby. She's getting older, but she's fine. I wanted to believe him. Maybe because believing him was easier than imagining the alternative. As the plane crossed the desert, memories floated through my mind like photographs scattered across a table. Grandma Eleanor teaching me how to bake peach cobbler without measuring cups. Her hands guiding mine as I learned to ride a bicycle. The way she'd always wave from the porch whenever I left for another deployment, pretending not to cry until my car disappeared. She was the safest place I had ever known. The thought of losing her while I was hundreds of miles away made every minute of that flight feel like an hour. By the time I reached her apartment complex, the California sun had already climbed high into the sky. Nothing looked different. Children rode bicycles. A gardener trimmed hedges. Someone laughed near the mailbox. Life had continued as though nothing terrible could possibly exist behind apartment number 214. Helen was waiting outside. She looked relieved the moment she saw me. You came. How bad is it? She hesitated, then simply unlocked the door. The smell hit me first. Not one smell, several. Spoiled food, old medication, dust, something damp, something forgotten. The curtains were closed even though it was almost noon. The living room television played quietly to an empty room. I walked farther inside. Grandma, no answer. Grandma, this time I heard the faintest whisper. Abby, her bedroom looked nothing like the place I remembered. She lay beneath a faded blanket, her silver hair spread across the pillow, her face so thin I could see every delicate contour beneath her skin. She looked smaller, not just physically, as though loneliness itself had been eating away at her. I knelt beside the bed. She opened her eyes slowly before reaching toward my face with trembling fingers. You came. I'll always come. Tears rolled down her cheeks before mine even started. I took her hand. It felt frighteningly light, almost weightless. When was the last time you ate? I asked gently. She tried to smile. I wasn't very hungry. The answer sounded rehearsed. The kind elderly people give when they're trying to protect someone else's feelings. I opened the refrigerator. 1 carton of expired milk. Half a loaf of moldy bread. 2 yogurt cups months past their expiration dates. Nothing else. I checked the pantry. Mostly empty. Then I noticed something sitting alone on the kitchen counter. A tiny birthday cake, still inside its plastic container. The frosting had cracked from drying out. "Happy birthday, Mom." The date printed on the bakery sticker was almost 3 weeks old. My chest tightened so suddenly it hurt to breathe. "Grandma," she looked away. "I thought maybe your father would stop by." Her voice barely carried across the room. "I didn't want him to feel bad that I forgot my own birthday." Forgot. The word echoed inside my head. She was making excuses for the son who had abandoned her. Helen quietly stepped beside me. "I knocked on her door that evening," she whispered. "She told me her son was coming for dinner." Helen swallowed hard. He never came. I stared at the untouched cake. One candle, still taped to the lid. Waiting. Just waiting. I suddenly understood why soldiers sometimes described heartbreak as a physical wound. Because this actually hurt. I looked back toward the bedroom. Grandma had fallen asleep again. Or maybe she'd simply become too exhausted to keep pretending everything was okay. I stepped into the hallway with Helen. "Where's my father?" Helen gave me a look that seemed equal parts sympathy and disbelief. "I honestly don't know." I pulled out my phone. Maybe he was at work. Maybe he'd been delayed. Maybe. Then I opened social media. The first photograph that appeared belonged to a woman named Vanessa, 26 years old. Fitness influencer. Perfect smile. Perfect makeup. The location tag sat beneath the picture. Little Napoli Italian restaurant. San Diego. Posted 37 minutes earlier. She stood beside a table covered in wine glasses and expensive seafood. My father sat beside her. His arm rested comfortably around her waist. He wore the same navy blazer he'd claimed he only saved for special family occasions. He was laughing. Really laughing. The kind of carefree smile I hadn't seen on his face in years. The caption underneath the photo read, "Sunday lunch with my favorite man, life is beautiful." I stared at the screen until the words blurred together. At that exact moment inside apartment 214, my grandmother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him after my grandfather died, was lying in bed too weak to eat. And my father was raising a glass of expensive wine to celebrate a life that apparently no longer included his own mother. I quietly locked my phone. Something inside me became perfectly still. Not rage. Not yet. Something colder. More dangerous. The kind of calm that arrives when every excuse you've ever made for someone finally dies. The ambulance doors slammed shut and I climbed inside without asking permission. The paramedic secured Grandma Eleanor to the stretcher while another adjusted an oxygen mask over her face. Her eyelids fluttered as though staying awake required more strength than she had left. I kept one hand wrapped around hers. She squeezed my fingers once. Just once. It was enough to tell me she knew I was there. "You're safe," I whispered. She gave the slightest nod before drifting back into sleep. The siren echoed through the streets of San Diego, but everything inside me felt strangely quiet. Military training had conditioned me to compartmentalize emotions during emergencies. Panic could wait. Grief could wait. Right now there was only one mission. Keep Grandma alive. The emergency physician met me outside her room nearly an hour later. Dr. Ramirez looked exhausted the way every good emergency doctor eventually does. "Are you her granddaughter?" "Yes." He folded his chart closed. "I'll be honest with you. Those words never lead anywhere good. She's severely dehydrated." I nodded. "I expected that." "Malnourished." Another nod. "She's also developed a serious infection that appears to have gone untreated." My stomach tightened. "Will she recover?" He paused just long enough to make my heartbeat stumble. "I believe she has a good chance now that she's here." Then he lowered his voice. "But if she'd arrived tomorrow instead of today..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Years in uniform had taught me to hear the words people couldn't bring themselves to say. Tomorrow would have been too late. I thanked him, walked into the hallway, and leaned against the wall for several seconds. For the first time since boarding the plane, I let myself cry. Not loudly. Just enough to release the pressure building behind my ribs. Then I wiped my face, squared my shoulders, and got back to work. Because someone had done this. Neglect like this doesn't happen overnight. It happens one ignored phone call at a time. Grandma slept most of the afternoon. Between rounds, a nurse helped me gather the few belongings she'd brought from home. A worn sweater. Reading glasses held together with tape. A family photo album. Her purse. When I opened the purse to look for insurance information, I noticed something unexpected. Her checkbook. Every bill appeared to be paid. Her pension deposits were arriving regularly. Social Security. Military survivor benefits from my late grandfather. Nothing suggested financial hardship, which made the empty refrigerator impossible to explain. I frowned. Something didn't fit. Grandma had always been careful with money. She clipped coupons even when she didn't need to. She still folded grocery bags because they might be useful someday. There was simply no logical reason she should have been starving. Unless someone else controlled the money. I called the bank listed on one of her statements. After verifying my identity and explaining the medical emergency, the representative remained professional but cautious. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't discuss account details over the phone." "I understand. There is one thing I can tell you." I waited. "There is an authorized financial manager on the account." My heart sank before she even spoke the name. "Your father, Daniel Turner." Of course. Years earlier, Grandma had added him after a minor surgery. "It'll make paying bills easier," he'd told her. At the time, it probably sounded responsible. Now it sounded dangerous. The following morning, after obtaining temporary medical authorization from Grandma, I visited the bank in person. A branch manager escorted me into a small office. Once the legal paperwork was verified, she printed several months of account activity. The stack of paper grew thicker and thicker. The first page looked normal. Utility payments, prescription copays, insurance. Then the withdrawals began. $5,000, $3,000, $2,000. Luxury department stores, high-end jewelry, resort hotels, wine merchants, designer boutique. I flipped another page. Italian restaurants, private golf club, luxury car dealership. Another page. International airline tickets, spa packages. Jewelry again. None of it matched the woman lying in a hospital bed wearing a sweater she'd repaired 3 separate times because she refused to waste money. The manager looked genuinely uncomfortable. "These transactions have been consistent for several months." I stared silently at the statements. Months, not weeks. Months. By lunchtime, anger had settled into something much more focused. Evidence, not emotion. Evidence wins. I drove back to Grandma's apartment one last time. Inside a kitchen drawer, I found neatly organized folders. She had kept every receipt, every birthday card, every handwritten note, everything, even unopened collection notices from medical providers. She hadn't ignored them intentionally. She simply believed her son was taking care of everything. Daniel said he'd handle it. That sentence appeared scribbled on a sticky note attached to one unpaid invoice. My father hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen her peace of mind. Late that afternoon, I couldn't ignore the question anymore. I drove to Little Napoli, the same restaurant from the photograph. Valet parking, fresh flowers, white tablecloths, soft piano music floated through the open doors. I almost laughed at the contrast. Grandma had expired yogurt. Dad had imported wine. A hostess approached. "Good evening. I'm looking for someone." She glanced around discreetly. "They're on the patio." I thanked her. Then I walked slowly toward the outdoor seating area. I stayed hidden behind a stone column. There they were. Daniel Turner, my father. Pressed blazer, expensive watch, relaxed smile. Across from him sat Vanessa, young enough that strangers probably assumed she was his daughter. Instead, she leaned across the table and kissed his cheek while laughing at something he'd just said. A waiter poured another glass of red wine. Dad raised it. "To new beginnings," she smiled. "To finally living for yourself." Then she reached across the table. "I still can't believe you sold your mother's old jewelry," he shrugged. "She doesn't even remember what she owns anymore." Vanessa giggled. "You spoil me." "I plan to keep doing it." My hands curled into fists. Not because of the affair. Marriages fail. People make mistakes. But because I knew exactly where the money had come from. Every necklace, every dinner, every vacation, every expensive gift. It all carried the invisible price tag of an elderly woman skipping meals so her son could pretend he was successful. I should have walked over, demanded answers, created a scene. Instead, years of military discipline held me exactly where I stood. Observe first, act second. Dad leaned back comfortably. "You know," he said, swirling his wine, "the old woman probably doesn't have much time left anyway." Vanessa looked almost embarrassed. "Daniel, what?" "You shouldn't say that." He shrugged again. "It's reality." Then he smiled. "When everything's settled, we'll finally be free." Free, the word echoed in my mind. Free from responsibility. Free from guilt. Free from the woman who had spent decades sacrificing for him. I realized then that I wasn't looking at the father who taught me to ride a bicycle. That man was gone. The person sitting across the patio was a stranger wearing his face. I quietly turned around and walked back toward the parking lot. Halfway there, I stopped beneath a streetlight. I unlocked my phone, scrolled through my contacts, found a name I hadn't called in nearly 4 years. Margaret Ellis, former Army JAG officer, now an attorney specializing in financial crimes involving vulnerable adults. She answered on the second ring. Abigail, I need your help. Her voice immediately sharpened. What happened? I looked back once toward the restaurant. Dad laughed loudly enough that I could hear him across the courtyard. My grandmother is in the hospital. A pause. And I think my father has been stealing from her. Margaret didn't interrupt. She simply listened. When I finished explaining everything I'd seen, she asked only one question. Abigail. Yes. Do you want the truth? I didn't hesitate. No. She sounded surprised. I want proof. There was a brief silence before she answered quietly. Good. Because proof is exactly where we're going to begin. Margaret Ellis never wasted words. Don't confront him again, she said over the phone. From this point forward, assume everything you do may end up in court. That sentence immediately shifted my mindset. For 12 years in the Army, I had learned that emotion clouds judgment. Facts don't. If I wanted justice for Grandma, I couldn't act like an angry daughter. I had to think like an investigator. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital before sunrise. Grandma was awake for the first time since I'd brought her in. Color had returned to her cheeks, though only slightly. She smiled when she saw me carrying a paper cup of coffee. You never liked hospital coffee, she whispered. I laughed softly. I still don't. For a few precious minutes, we talked about ordinary things. The weather, the roses outside her apartment, a television show she'd been watching months ago. I deliberately avoided mentioning my father. Then she surprised me. Have you talked to Daniel? The question hung between us. I chose my words carefully. No. She nodded as though she'd expected that answer. I don't want you two fighting because of me. I leaned forward and kissed her forehead. This isn't because of you. She looked at me with the same gentle eyes that had comforted me after scraped knees and broken hearts. I know that look, Abby. What look? The one you get when you've already made a decision. She wasn't wrong. I had. But my decision wasn't revenge. It was accountability. By mid-morning, Margaret met me at the hospital cafeteria. She spread a yellow legal pad across the table. Let's organize this. She drew 4 columns. Financial records, medical records, witnesses, legal authority. We don't tell a story, she explained. We prove one. For the next 3 hours, we built a timeline. Every unexplained withdrawal, every missed doctor's appointment, every unpaid medical invoice, every luxury purchase that appeared within days of money disappearing from Grandma's account. Patterns emerged almost immediately. The withdrawals increased each month. Grandma's prescriptions became less frequent. Her grocery purchases nearly disappeared. Meanwhile, restaurant charges and luxury shopping steadily climbed. Margaret circled one date. This one bothers me. It was Grandma's birthday. The same day she'd waited beside that untouched cake. $3,200 had been spent at an upscale jewelry store. My stomach turned. The bank's fraud department agreed to cooperate after receiving Grandma's written authorization. A senior investigator named Kevin invited us into a secure office. He slid several enlarged signature samples across the desk. These are interesting. At first glance, they looked identical. Then Kevin pointed to tiny details. The pressure pattern changes. He placed another document beside it. The angle of the capital E is inconsistent. Another. The spacing is wrong. I frowned. So, he looked directly at me. I don't believe your grandmother signed these authorization forms. The room became very quiet. You think someone forged them? I think a forensic handwriting examiner is going to have a very interesting week. That afternoon, we visited Grandma's apartment building again. Helen wasn't the only neighbor willing to speak. Mr. Alvarez from downstairs remembered carrying groceries upstairs because Grandma had become too weak. Mrs. Chen across the hall recalled hearing her cry after phone calls with Daniel. Another neighbor described seeing my father collect mail every few weeks. He always seemed to be in a hurry, Mr. Alvarez said. He never stayed. Every statement was documented. Every interview recorded with permission. Nobody exaggerated. Nobody speculated. They simply described what they'd seen. Truth has a quiet strength. It doesn't need embellishment. The hospital social worker requested a formal interview with Grandma. I remained outside the room. When she finished nearly an hour later, she approached me with a folder tucked beneath her arm. I can't discuss everything she shared. I understand. But I can tell you this. She paused. Your grandmother genuinely believed your father was paying all of her bills. I closed my eyes. He told her not to worry about paperwork. The social worker nodded. She trusted him completely. Trust. That was the real thing he'd stolen. Money could eventually be recovered. Trust couldn't. Late that evening, my phone vibrated. It was my younger brother, Ethan. Abby, his voice sounded nervous. Dad says you've been accusing him of stealing. I haven't accused him of anything. Then why are lawyers calling? I stared out the hospital window. Because somewhere between lunch with Vanessa and the bank's fraud department, my father had finally realized someone was asking questions. Ethan, I said quietly, when was the last time you visited Grandma? Silence. A couple months. Try 8. He didn't answer. I thought Dad was handling everything. So did Grandma. Another long pause. I didn't know. I believe you. And I did. Ethan lived in another state. He'd trusted the same lies I had. The difference was that I had walked into apartment 214. I had seen the truth with my own eyes. The following morning, Margaret received an unexpected call. Adult Protective Services had reviewed the preliminary evidence. They were opening an official investigation. So quickly, I asked. Margaret nodded. Cases involving vulnerable seniors move faster than people realize when the evidence is this strong. Before noon, APS contacted the San Diego Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit. By early afternoon, detectives requested copies of the bank records. The pieces were beginning to connect. No dramatic speeches, no shouting. Just professionals doing their jobs. Exactly the way justice is supposed to work. Meanwhile, my father continued living as though nothing had changed. His social media painted a picture of effortless happiness. Dinner on the waterfront. Weekend golf. Photos of expensive wine. Vanessa smiling beside him. He had no idea investigators were quietly reconstructing every financial decision he'd made during the past year. Margaret advised me not to respond to any messages from him, so I didn't. When he called, I let it ring. When he texted, I archived the conversation. The less he knew, the better. 2 days after my arrival in San Diego, I stepped outside the hospital to get some fresh air. My phone rang again. This time it was Kevin from the bank. The handwriting examiner completed an initial review. I held my breath. And he believes the authorization signatures are highly inconsistent with your grandmother's verified handwriting. In plain English, Kevin didn't hesitate. They appear to be forged. For several seconds I couldn't speak, not because I was surprised, because hearing the truth spoken aloud made it real. This was no longer neglect, no longer suspicion. This had become an alleged financial crime supported by evidence. I thanked him and ended the call. As I slipped the phone into my pocket, a dark SUV pulled into the hospital parking lot. A man and a woman stepped out. Both wore business attire. Both carried identification cases. They looked around before walking toward the entrance. One of them noticed me. Major Turner. Yes. He offered his hand. I'm Detective Harris. He nodded toward his colleague. And this is Investigator Collins from Adult Protective Services. My pulse remained steady, but I knew exactly what their arrival meant. The investigation had officially moved beyond paperwork. It had entered its next phase. And somewhere across San Diego, my father still believed he was untouchable. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. At 8:14 that morning, Detective Harris called again. We're in position. I looked through the hospital window toward the bright California sky. The city looked peaceful, almost indifferent. People were walking their dogs. Parents were dropping children off at school. Somewhere someone was complaining about traffic. Life rarely pauses while another family falls apart. I'll stay here, I told him. I think that's best. There was no reason for me to witness the arrest. This had never been about humiliation. It had always been about accountability. I ended the call and walked back into Grandma's room. She was awake, staring quietly out her own window. Beautiful morning, she said. It is. I helped adjust her blanket before sitting beside her bed. Neither of us spoke for a while. Sometimes silence carries more love than conversation ever could. About 40 minutes later, my phone vibrated. A single text from Detective Harris. He's in custody. Nothing more. No dramatic details. No celebration. Just 5 words. I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking the phone again. Grandma noticed my expression. What happened? I hesitated. This was the moment I had dreaded most. The investigation moved forward. She studied my face. They arrested Daniel. Her voice didn't sound shocked, only tired. as though some part of her had expected this day long before I had. She closed her eyes. A single tear escaped. I never wanted this for my son. I reached for her hand. I know. Another long silence filled the room. Finally, she whispered something I will never forget. But I never wanted this life for myself either. That sentence changed everything. For days I had worried she might blame me. Instead, she acknowledged something she had probably hidden for years. She had been suffering quietly, protecting the very person who was hurting her. Later that afternoon, Detective Harris stopped by the hospital. The arrest went peacefully, he said. He didn't resist. No, Harris paused. I think he realized resistance wouldn't change anything. He handed me a folder. Inside was an inventory of property seized during the investigation. Financial records, electronic devices, business documents, luxury watches, jewelry. Some of it still carried store tags. One receipt immediately caught my attention. The diamond bracelet purchased for Vanessa. $3,200. The exact amount withdrawn from Grandma's account on her birthday. I slowly closed the folder. No courtroom speech could ever explain betrayal as clearly as that receipt. Over the following weeks, the legal process moved steadily forward. The district attorney filed multiple charges involving financial exploitation of an elderly dependent adult, forgery, and theft. My father accepted responsibility for some actions while denying others. His attorneys argued poor judgment, stress, miscommunication, administrative mistakes. But documents don't become confused. Bank statements don't exaggerate. Security cameras don't misunderstand. Evidence has no emotions, only facts. One by one, those facts dismantled every excuse. The forensic handwriting examiner testified that several financial authorizations were inconsistent with Grandma's genuine signature. The bank investigator explained the unusual withdrawal pattern. Neighbors described her declining condition. Doctors testified about severe malnutrition and dehydration. Adult Protective Services documented months of neglect. No single piece of evidence destroyed my father's credibility. Together they did. Vanessa testified as well. She admitted accepting expensive gifts. She admitted believing my father's version of events. Then she looked directly at the jury. If I had known his mother was living like that, I would have walked away the first day. She returned every piece of jewelry investigators could recover. It didn't erase her choices, but it demonstrated something my father never did: remorse. The sentencing hearing arrived nearly 5 months after my flight to San Diego. I attended in uniform, not to make a statement, simply because I had reported directly from military leave throughout the investigation. Dad looked older than I remembered. Gray seemed to have appeared overnight. He glanced toward me several times. I met his eyes only once, not with anger, not with hatred, only sadness. The judge spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He acknowledged the financial losses, but he spent even longer discussing trust. The greatest harm in this case, he said, was not measured in dollars. It was measured in the abuse of a vulnerable mother's confidence. Those words settled over the courtroom like heavy rain. The sentence included prison time, restitution, financial penalties, and permanent restrictions on managing the finances of dependent adults. The bailiff stepped forward. My father briefly turned toward me. I made mistakes. His voice barely carried across the room. I know. I never meant... He couldn't finish. For years I had imagined what I might say if this day ever came. Instead, only one sentence felt honest. Grandma needed a son. I paused. You chose something else. He lowered his head. The bailiff gently guided him away. That was the last time I saw him. Grandma never asked to attend the trial. She preferred spending those mornings in physical therapy. Slowly, almost stubbornly, she rebuilt her strength. First a walker, then a cane. Eventually, she insisted on making her own tea again. One afternoon, she laughed because she'd burned a batch of cookies. I suppose I'm getting stronger, she said. I have enough energy to ruin dessert. It was the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in years. Several months later, after consulting with her doctors, we packed the few belongings she truly wanted to keep. Family photographs, Grandpa's Army medals, her favorite cookbook, a small ceramic angel that had sat beside her bed for decades. She moved into my home, not because she couldn't live alone anymore, because neither of us wanted her to. Sunday dinners became our new tradition. Nothing elaborate. Roast chicken, fresh vegetables. Sometimes peach cobbler made from the recipe she'd taught me when I was a little girl standing on a kitchen stool. One evening after dinner, we sat on the back porch watching the sunset. The air smelled of jasmine. Birds settled into the trees as daylight faded. Grandma rocked gently in her chair. Abby? Yes. Do you regret reporting your father? I didn't answer immediately. It deserved more than a quick response. Finally, I looked toward the horizon. I regret believing everything was fine when my instincts told me otherwise. She nodded. I regret every birthday I missed. Another pause. And I regret that you spent so long believing you had to suffer alone. She reached across the space between us and squeezed my hand. I don't regret you coming home. Neither did I. Because justice wasn't what healed our family. Showing up did. Sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it arrives carrying a suitcase, opens a forgotten apartment door, and quietly refuses to leave. If there's one lesson I carried away from everything that happened, it's this. Never assume that someone else is checking on the people you love. Make the phone call. Take the drive. Knock on the door. You may discover everything is fine. Or you may arrive just in time to change someone's life. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed someone quietly caring for an aging parent or sadly abandoning one? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience may encourage someone else to reach out to a loved one today. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about family courage and justice, please subscribe and join us. We share new stories regularly, and we'd be honored to have you with us on the next one. Until then, take care of the people who once took care of you.